All right, let's go on to tier three here. Who did you have in tier number three?
Sure. So a smaller tier for me, I have Pat Fryermuth at tight end 8, Evan Ingram at 9, Dalton Schultz now with the Texans at 10, and David Njoku at 11 with the Browns.
Nice. Yeah, so my tier's a little bit bigger. So I put tight end seven in here, which was Evan Ingram for me. And then I put David Njoku at eight. Darren Waller comes in at nine, like I said before. And then Pat Fryermuth at tight end 10. Dalton Schultz at tight end 11. And then I put Chigoziem Okonkwo from the Tennessee Titans at tight end 12. I snuck him into this third tier. We both have him at tight end 12. I know I have him a tier higher. So maybe I guess I could talk about Okonkwo a little bit here. But yeah, for me, I mean, Austin Hooper commanded a lot of the receiving snaps in that offense. Last year, it was like 57% versus 31% for Okonkwo. So as a result, Okonkwo only played 50% of the Titans' offensive snaps. Hooper's now off to Las Vegas, and Okonkwo now stands alone as kind of the favorite to target or to take over the targets for the tight end one role in Tennessee. Last year, he had a position leading 2.61 yards per route run and a 26.2% target rate, which led to a 31.3% explosive play rate. Those are really promising numbers for a tight end, even on a smaller sample size. It's really nice to see. I think that's what we're both, kind of excited about for him, even though it was a smaller sample size. And then he tied for the position lead in yards after the catch per reception at 7.8 with Dallas Goedert. He averaged 0.22 missed tackles forced per reception, which was also a top five number among tight ends with at least 30 targets. So I do think with an increased snap share and target rate, obviously those numbers might come down a little bit, but he's showed enough on that smaller sample size that he looks like a very promising tight end option, especially in a very volatile position where production is hard to come by. I think he's worth taking the shot on here within the top 12 and, in that kind of tier three range, even though you probably don't have to draft him as close to some of these other tight ends that are in this range. But I do think he's a good bet to finish as at least as a low end tight end one on a team that, targeted the tight end position at a top three rate last season as well. So I'm pretty excited about Okonkwo. How about you?
My concern is I think the playing time could still be an issue with him. Like any stat that you looked at, yards per route run, fantasy points per route, he was the top tight end last year on a small sample size. The only problem is he was 50th in routes run. And we've seen this in Tennessee for a couple of years now, where they like to have a bit of a rotation at tight end, have two guys who are playing in 12 personnel. Maybe one of them's playing in 11 personnel on early downs, and then someone else is playing in 11 personnel on third downs. Like we thought Austin Hooper could have a bigger role in this offense. We thought Jonnu Smith a couple years ago would have a bigger role in this offense, but they pretty continuously use different players in different spots. And they added Trevin Wesco in free agency, who's been a clear run blocker so far in his career. I definitely think he'll be playing in 12 personnel. And then I don't know how Josh Wiley will fit into the mix, but Tennessee loves using a lot of tight ends and loves rotating them. So I could see them having four on the roster. Jeff Swaim has been someone that the last couple of years took significant snaps at tight end for them. I believe he's still a free agent, so he could still resign if Tennessee wants to add another tight end. So I think Okonkwo is potentially more talented than some of the tight ends that they've had in recent years. So ideally, that's good enough for him to see increased playing time. But my concern is that maybe he starts playing more in 11 personnel, but then stops playing as much in 12 personnel, and they start having more blockers in those situations. So they haven't really had a tight end on that team finish in the top 15 in recent years with this coaching staff. I think he's someone where once we start to see the preseason, I could start being higher on him. And even though, like you said, we both have him at tight end 12, you have him closer to these other tight ends in this tier where I have him closer to everyone else. Mm-hmm. But in the recent years, we've seen some of this rotation at tight end in the preseason. And if everyone's playing, they're using their tight end similarly to how they end up getting used in the regular season, which is why in the preseason in past years, I've started up higher on Tennessee tight ends and then started getting lower as the preseasons progress, seeing them not see as many snaps in all situations as you would hope to see. So I think for me, he has the talent that if he starts seeing as much playing time as we hope, then he could be even higher. He could end up in tier two. But unlike the other players in this tier who I think are relatively safe options, I think he could be lower in that. He could be somewhere in the tight end 15 to 20 range, even though his per play stats will continue to be really good.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's fair. It's definitely, a concern. So even though we love the kind of underlying numbers, it's definitely, reasons to temper expectations for Okonkwo here in 2023. All right, tier four. Who do
All
you
right,
have
tier
going in
four.
here?
I have a good 9 players in this tier, I believe. Like we just talked about, Okonkwo at 12. Then I have Tyler Higbee at tight end 13. Dalton Kincaid, the rookie with the Bills, at tight end 14. Greg Dulcich at tight end 15 with the Broncos. Cole Kmet at 16. Juwan Johnson with the Saints at 17. Gerald Everett with the Chargers at 18. Sam Laporta with the Lions at 19. Irv Smith Jr., who the Bengals added in free agency at 20, and then Mike Gesicki, who was added to the Patriots at tight end 21.
Nice. Yep. I also have 9 players in my tier four. So I got Tyler Higbee with the Rams at 13, Cole Kmet at 14, Gerald Everett with the Chargers at 15. Then I put Irv Smith at tight end 16, Greg Dulcich at 17, Dalton Kincaid at 18, Juwan Johnson at 19, and then I put Zach Ertz of the Cardinals at tight end 20, and Sam Laporta of the Lions at tight end 21. So one of the ones that stands out off the top is Dalton Kincaid. You have him as tight end 14. I have him as tight end 18, even within this same tier. What is it about the rookie Dalton Kincaid that you like in Buffalo?
Sure. So at this point in the rankings, it's a lot of looking for upside. If you looked at our tier three, we didn't talk too much about some of the other tight ends that we agreed on, but those are relatively safe options with Fryermuth, Ingram, and Njoku, all three of them with the same teams that they've been on recently, with the same quarterbacks. We've seen what they can do. They don't have the same talent as the tight ends in tiers one and tier two, but they see a lot of opportunities, and that should stay the same. So they're relatively safe options, but they're probably not going to be people that get into the top 5 at tight ends, barring injuries to the tight ends in the top 2 tiers. So at this point, it's likely I'm trying to pair someone with one of those tight ends who I think could do really well. And I think Kincaid fits that description. He's probably the second best tight end prospect that we've seen coming out of the draft in the past 5 years. Outside of Kyle Pitts, I believed he was the highest tight end that we've had ranked in our draft rankings heading into the draft. And then a lot of it is the Buffalo offense that intrigues me about it. I know Dawson Knox is still on the team, but Knox has been the best tight end in terms of touchdown per receptions in the past 2 years, in the past 5 years. He just sees a lot of his receptions turned into touchdowns, which also means he doesn't see quite as many receptions, but he's been top 15 in both touchdowns and touchdowns per game, not just for tight ends, but all receivers. So the fact that he scores so many touchdowns is definitely helpful in fantasy. We've seen Knox be a top 10 fantasy tight end from this alone. And no offense to Knox, but Knox is a decent tight end, worthy of being a starter in the league. But I don't think he has the same talent as Kincaid has. So I think Kincaid can be even better in this offense. I think they'll use him almost just as much as a slot receiver as a tight end. And we've seen in the past how successful slot receivers have been in this offense. And that wasn't as true last year because they just didn't have the same players in the slot as before. And a lot of this, as well as partially why I like Darren Waller so much in Brian Daboll's offense, which is the old Bills offense, and that how much they like throwing to tight ends, especially in the red zone. So a huge thing for tight ends is being able to score touchdowns and having that chance to score touchdowns. And when you don't have one of these top 5, top 7 guys, then the biggest thing that you can do is try to get someone who can score you a touchdown, because chances are, if they're not scoring you a touchdown, they're only going to score you a couple points by catching a few passes for 30 to 40 yards. So if you can have someone that scores a touchdown, that's a huge difference. So I know there's definitely risk involved depending on how much they use him versus Knox, or how much they increase their two tight end usage this year compared to past years. But I think the upside is there. And when you compare them to a bunch of these other tight ends where you've seen what they can do, and you've seen that they're not top 5 fantasy tight ends. So I'd rather take a chance of someone who can get there versus someone who I know won't.
Yeah, no, that's a good call. And I do like Kincaid. I guess I'm just more like kind of tempering expectations. I know the Bills, they weren't like very high in tight end target rate last season, but I do think that will increase with Kincaid coming in and, talking about how they plan to utilize him in that offense. Like you said, the more of the slot usage. I know they've even referenced using him more like Travis Kelce. So we'll see how much of that actually comes, to fruition. It's not something I think, I guess, that will happen right away. It could take a little bit more time for him to kind of be this great fantasy starter. But I do think second half of his rookie season at the earliest is where I think he'll start to become more relevant. Dawson Knox, yeah, being there, it takes away some, but I think mostly for me, it was maybe more concerned that he'll take away some of those red zone targets or touchdown targets away from Kincaid. And yeah, I know you mentioned that it could be Kincaid that takes over that role. So however it goes, either way, it depends. We won't know until the season starts. It's going to be fun, obviously, because of Kincaid's profile, like you mentioned. So I think he could be a really nice fit in that offense. I'm just kind of like tempering expectations, I guess, a little bit for his rookie season.
That's fair. And I think part of tempering that expectations is not putting him in the top 12, since I can very well see him being a top 10 tight end for a number of years. One note that you made that I want to comment on, and that the Bills didn't target tight ends very much last year. And I think tight end targets in general are something that are a lot more tied to the quality of tight end that a team has, more so than team history. Um, I know like people talk about Russell Wilson and how much he's thrown to tight ends, and that's very depending on the quality of tight end he's had. I think Matt Ryan is an extreme example of this, but Matt Ryan in his career didn't throw to tight ends much, then got Tony Gonzalez, and they were one of the top teams at throwing to tight ends. Then they lost Tony Gonzalez, and for a number of years, they were one of the worst teams at throwing to tight ends. Then they got Kyle Pitts, and then they started throwing to tight ends again. So it's something where if you have a good tight end, you're going to throw to him. And if you don't, you're not going to. So I'm not all that concerned about that part of the Bills' history and throwing to tight ends. I think as long as Kincaid has the talent, they're going to get him the ball, where you see that a little bit at running backs too, that if you have a great receiving running back, they end up seeing more targets. And if you don't, then there's still going to be an option when like you're under pressure and you need to dump the ball off to someone. So it's not quite as true at running back, because you see some running backs get targets even if they're not as good, just because of the situation. But you don't see that quite as much at tight end, because you have the option to throw to other players too. So I think as long as Kincaid is as talented as we think he is, the Bills could be one of the top teams at throwing to tight ends if he's that talented.
For sure. Yeah, like I said, I do think it'll definitely increase. They drafted him in the first round because they want to utilize him, right? So I think he has the profile, and it makes sense that it would increase this season. And yeah, like you said about the running backs too, it is kind of true too. Like if you look at Daniel Jones, for example, like with and without Saquon Barkley, his target rate to the running back is a lot higher, obviously with Barkley in the lineup than without. So, but yes, I definitely get what you're saying there. So one of the other guys within this tier that I have a little bit higher, I went with Irv Smith. So we kind of touched on Irv Smith in our first episode when we looked at the ADP risers and fallers a few weeks ago. And I'm still fairly excited for him and kind of ready for that year 5 breakout, at least as like maybe a mid to high end tight end too. I think he's shown, a strong ability to get open last season. He had a 67.6% open target rate per PFF. And 26% of his targets were in the red zone in just 8 games last season, led to a couple touchdowns in Minnesota. But again, the Bengals, not a team that typically targeted the tight end at a high rate last season, but I do think, to your point, Irv Smith is kind of one of the better target earners. I think he could be, just because of his skill set and his ability to get open. I'm not obviously super excited about him. I don't think he'll be the primary target in this offense, obviously, but I am confident, obviously, in the passing attack itself, led by Joe Burrow, and still a believer in the talent of Irv Smith there. So for me, I guess you mentioned the high upside thing if you haven't gone tight end yet. I think a lot of the times what I've done in drafts is kind of taken from that tier 2 range, potentially even Travis Kelce, and I'm looking to pair maybe a more consistent tight end in the tight end 2 spot, which is what I'm looking for in my backup in redraft, is a guy that I can kind of plug in and play that isn't necessarily going to kill me if I do have to play him, more so than kind of like a boom bust, low floor, high ceiling type guy, like a Taysom Hill, for example, is somebody that I'm thinking about. I'm not too worried about the kind of the boom weeks from the tight end 2s, because most likely when you put them in, they'll be duds, and when you leave them on your bench is when they're going to go off, like the DraftKings ad says. But thinking about, again, Taysom Hill or someone in that range, it's hard to know when those weeks are going to be. So I'd rather have my kind of surefire tight end 1 that I could kind of lock in each week, and if that guy misses a week or during a bye week, then I could put in a tight end 2 like an Irv Smith, who should have a decent floor in a high-powered offense. And even though, again, not the primary option, should still get enough targets to be productive, while also having a potential big game upside every once in a while as well.
Like, my concern with him is a lot of it has to do with the Bengals offense. He's not going to be the top receiving option. He's not going to be their second best receiving option. I don't think he'll reach their third best receiving option. And if you include Joe Mixon, who should be in more in the passing game, I don't know if he's their fourth best option in the passing game either. Like you said, they haven't been throwing to tight ends much. And I think a lot of that has to do with the players around him more so than the tight ends. They've had Hayden Hurst there. They've had CJ Uzoma there. After their time with the Bengals, they went on to get $7 or $8 million a year with their next contracts with their new team. So it's not like they've had bad options in Cincinnati at tight end. They've just had so much better options at wide receiver, as well as the run game. So I think, he'll see a decent number of targets because it's the Bengals offense. They're going to throw a lot. They're going to have a lot of good things in the offense. But my probably bigger concern is a lot of the good things that we've seen out of Smith so far in his career has been his work in the red zone near the goal line, being able to score a touchdown a decent amount once he gets playing time in that situation. But the Bengals were above average in tight end routes near the goal line, and again, bottom 3 in terms of touchdowns by tight ends at the goal line. So even though they've had opportunities in terms of route run, they have not had opportunities in terms of touchdowns. So I'm not sure how much Smith is an upgrade over the tight ends they've had in the past in the goal line. I think, he was very young when he got into the league. So even though he's been in for a couple of years and dealt with a number of injuries, he's still relatively young. So he still has that upside of maybe he is better than the tight ends they've had in the past. But my concern is, even if he is notably better, there's not enough passes to go around for him to reach that top 5 or maybe even top 10 production at tight end. So that's probably my biggest concern, is I don't think he has quite the same amount of upside versus taking a chance on some of the other players who, most of the guys I have above him are younger than him or immediately out of him younger than him. And the ones who aren't have been known to be able to score a number of touchdowns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's fair. And I guess, that kind of approach for me, that kind of safe or consistency, I guess what I'm looking for, kind of continues with like putting Zach Ertz as tight end 20 for me. Another guy that I think he'll be involved enough in the offense, and even though it's a much worse offense than Cincinnati, unless Clayton Tune starts, but he should be more of a priority, in the passing game, especially with DeAndre Hopkins gone. I know Zach Ertz is far from like the sexiest name to target at this point in his career, but again, kind of one of those reliable, solid performers that hopefully won't kill your fantasy team if you do have to start him. Even last year, he had like 7 top 12 PPR finishes for the position. That was with Kyler Murray at quarterback. But again, for more Clayton Tune propaganda, I think there's a chance that it could be better than expected if he gets a start. But for me, I don't think Zach Ertz is costing people much to draft. So I think you could definitely afford to leave him until that tier 5 range where you have him. I just think he's worth highlighting a bit earlier because of that kind of reliable production he offers, whereas some of these other guys we either haven't seen it before or maybe in that more boom bust territory that I try to avoid with tight end too. But there's definitely a reason you can leave him until later in drafts for sure. But
Yeah, and it's worth noting with Ertz, there is the risk that he is coming off an ACL injury, so he might not even be ready to start the season. So that's a little concerning. Arizona's been fairly quiet in terms of how much they're willing to say about when they expect players to come back. So it's a little hard to know exactly when Ertz will be back. But even then, they did draft Trey McBride with the 55th overall pick a year ago. They gave him a ton of playing time over the stretch last season once Ertz went down with injury. So McBride will definitely be at least somewhat part of the offense. There's probably room for 2 tight ends in Arizona just because they don't have the depth at wide receiver. So we could see a lot of 2 tight end sets once both players are healthy. It's just hard for me to see Ertz being the player that he once was coming off an injury at his age when they just drafted his replacement a year ago. So there's also a chance that they end up trading Ertz or cutting Ertz at some point once he's healthy as well, just because this is definitely a rebuilding year in Arizona. And Ertz, while Travis Kelce is the oldest player that you're considering drafting, Ertz is definitely up there in terms of how old he is compared to all the other players you're drafting at running back or wide receiver or tight end. So we did see him be one of the better fantasy tight ends just 2 years ago, but I'd probably rather take a chance on some of the other players who you've probably drafted a guy who's reliable. So you probably want someone with a little more upside with your backup tight end, since there are 12 players that you can at least put in your starting lineup this year. So I'd rather pair that with a younger player. We've been going over with, I know rookies don't have a strong track record of being great fantasy tight ends, but there's a number of rookies that I'd be fine taking a chance on just because if they don't work out, you can cut them and just try a different tight end. Since if you don't have one of the guys in tier 1 or tier 2, then you're probably going to be struggling most of the year trying to find someone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic about the injury. I probably shouldn't be, I guess, but I could definitely push him down as well too if there's more news about his recovery potentially causing him to miss the start of the season. So